He flipped a coin on screen and a life flipped behind it. In 1932's Scarface, George Raft played mobster Guino Ronaldo with a single gesture. That tiny flip became his trademark, and it was a hint of Raft's real life, a dancer turned star born amid Hell's Kitchen gangland, flirting off-screen with some of Hollywood's greatest beauties and actual gangsters alike. In the end, the silver-tongued actor died almost unknown and nearly penniless. You might think you know his story, the hits he turned down, the legends he made for other men, the dangerous deals done at underworld tables where eyes did most of the talking. You don't, at least not all of it. This is the full story of Hollywood's real-life mafioso, George Raft. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. George Raft was born in 1901, or possibly 1895 on the mean streets of Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen. Birth dates were elastic in Old Hollywood, and they were elastic in Hell's Kitchen long before that. Raft would insist on one date. Municipal records would suggest another. What isn't in dispute is the neighborhood. Set black fire escapes, the clang of the L, and a street curriculum in survival. His German immigrant parents eked out a living in carnivals and midway shows, and young George grew up tougher than most boys. His mother, Eva, taught him steps before she taught him sentences, and his father, Conrad, taught him that New York does not accept IOUs from kids, so he'd better learn how to tough it out on the street. He quit school at 12 and left home by 13, drifting into hard Scrabble jobs to survive. He tried electrician's helper work, briefly laced up boxing gloves as George Raft, and even aimed for a minor league baseball career in Springfield. None of these stuck. His batting average was poor, the ring knocked him down, and he found himself constantly on the hunt for the next paycheck. Then he realized he could use his body in a different way, back to something his mother had taught him. "I saw guys fighting, so I fought," Raft later recalled with a grin. "I saw guys playing ball, so I played ball. Then I saw guys dancing, and getting paid for it." His instinct turned out to be right. He was putting the dance steps Eva taught him to use. By his late teens, he was sweeping up dance halls and arcades and finally dancing full-time at Manhattan amusement parks. His flair for the tango in particular earned him notice, and he started turning heads in the speakeasies of New York's roaring 20s. He caught on as a taxi dancer, a paid companion for ballroom dancing, eventually finding a prominent place in the review of Texas Guinan, the legendary saloon queen of New York's nightclub scene. Guinan herself, a flamboyant former dancer, made Raft part of her stage act, and the young man thrived. It was work that required charm, rhythm, and the practical diplomacy of a bouncer. The scene was one of thrill and recklessness, the blare of a trumpet, a line of fan dancers and feathers, a hostess with the voice of a foghorn and the disposition of a ringmaster. Guinan presided like a benevolent dictator over an illegal kingdom. "Hello, suckers," she'd bark at the front table. The rich and the reckless came to be seen, and the city's vice squad came to make a point. It was Guinan, according to more than one witness, who put Raft into the room where careers happened, and she was the one who put him forward for a Charleston competition that turned the heads of talent scouts and newspapermen. Raft did the rest. He moved with a certain seasoned insolence and the supple waist of a man who knows how to keep balance when the floor is crowded. You could walk in with a question mark above your name and walk out with an offer. That is exactly what happened to George. And so New York's nightlife led Raft to the Great White Way. He landed on Broadway, performing in shows like The City Chap and the musical revues Gay Paris and Padlocks of 1927. The pay was better than the dance halls, the company was rowdier and better dressed. He was soon rotating through more revues with titles that now sound like postcards from a vanished world, Mad Hatton and Palm Beach Nights among them. Critics noted his footwork, calling him the fastest hoofer on the bill, and they also spotted the mischievous intensity that would later become his trademark. The line between chorus boy and star is thin and mostly made of nerve. Raft had plenty, and it led him into shadier parts of the theater and beyond, down into Manhattan's underground, whiskey-soaked places where the spotlight was rarely found. Speakeasies were in fact not theaters at all. They were ecosystems. The men buying the champagne had friends in unadvertised businesses. Raft didn't have to invent his underworld bona fides when he moved west. He had spent years dancing for and sometimes alongside men who funded the very rooms he performed in. His New York circle included the likes of Oni Madden and a little later Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. These were informal associations that were built on proximity, loyalty, and in part the inevitability of a hungry young man working where the money was. When police padlocked one club, the party decamped a few blocks and renamed itself. Raft learned that the best way to leave a place was with a handshake, and the best way to arrive was with a tip for the doorman. He was careful. He was genial with everyone and in debt to no one. He married early in 1923 to Grace Mulrooney, but it quickly soured. Nonetheless, devoutly Catholic and stubborn, she refused him a divorce when it quickly became clear they were not really meant for one another. The result was an arrangement that would twist Raft's personal life for the next 4 decades. He remained legally married to a woman he eventually did not live with. He kept Grace on a stipend for years and spoke of her without bitterness. Free in practical terms to pursue romances and partnerships, but never free to wed the women he loved. Before I get into George's big break, I'd like to show you the range of exclusively designed shirts I have for sale over at the Hollywood Mystery Store. All the shirts are designed in-house and are completely exclusive to Hollywood Mysteries. You won't see these anywhere else, so if you're wearing one, it'll be something a little special. I have designs featuring quite a few silent era stars such as Louise Brooks, Gloria Swanson, Rudolph Valentino, and Pola Negri. You can find a link to the store down in the description and also on screen now. Every sale is a huge help to the channel, and I love seeing the messages you send with the purchases over on the site. Thank you so much to all of you who have purchased one. Feel free to check it out and grab some unique Hollywood merch. By the late 1920s, he'd built a solid dancer's career on stage, but the lure of the movies was calling. When Hollywood beckoned, Raft answered, ironically summoned not as a dancer, but on 1931's Quick Millions, as a heavy aiding Spencer Tracy. Raft stole his few shots with the useful economy. He'd give a glance, the jaw setting, the sense he was already considering where to stand when the fight began. The dancer's spine gave him an advantage most actors couldn't fake. He knew how to stand like he'd seen it all and how to walk like he owned the next 10 seconds. It was his first real gangster role, and the formula clicked. Once in Tinseltown, Raft's career exploded along the very path he might once have disdained, straight into the criminal underworld, on film. He showed up next in Taxi, another pre-code film that was released in 1932. It's mostly notable today for being the second most misquoted film in movie history, after Casablanca. For the record, James Cagney's line was, in reality, the far less economical. "Come out and take it, you dirty yellow-bellied rat, or I'll give it to you through the door." But the line, of course, morphed over time in the popular imagination as, "You dirty rat, you killed my brother." Meanwhile, there's a throwaway sequence that looks like nothing but gives us a lot of George Raft. It's a dance contest where Raft's character beats Cagney's and gets decked for it. What lingers is how quickly he telegraphs arrogance and how deftly he absorbs the inevitable humiliation from the star-turned Cagney. It was a masterclass in making an impact in 2 minutes. One idea, but a permanent impression. Then came Scarface. Here's how it unfolded in the studio on one black and white day in September 1931. On a soundstage shaped like a Chicago nightclub, Howard Hawks is blocking a scene he knows is too quiet. Paul Muni is the center of the frame, as Tony Camonte, a force of appetite and violence. But the lieutenant standing beside him, a character named Guino Ronaldo, looks underwritten to Hawks. The actor playing him hasn't said much, and when he does, he sounds like a street kid double-checking his vowels. So, Hawks tells George Raft to do something with his hands. Raft, who has learned to make a gesture carry further than a line, takes out a coin and begins idly flipping it from knuckle to knuckle. The set inhales. The shot becomes a kind of visual music. Now we have a hard man making time into a toy. The coin transforms a secondary hood into a figure with a private ritual, someone who measures risk by feel. Later, when Raft parodied the bit in Some Like It Hot, he was in on the joke. In 1931, it was pure invention. This was a trick of the fingers that would encode itself across the culture. It was copied in cartoons, recycled by pulp villains, and it was a signal that a movie dancer had learned how to make silence talk. A recipe for stardom. Scarface landed in 1932 with bruising force. It was the most brazen of the early gangster films, the one that clanged the metal gate and let the audience peer through, and Raft walked out of it with a brand. He didn't have to chew scenery. What Raft brought was a study in poise. The movie changed his price and his options immediately. Paramount signed him and began engineering vehicles that could drape themselves over his unique silhouette. Publicists around town started claiming they had discovered him in a malt shop, claiming that he carried with him a little of the night. For once, they actually underplayed the myth of an actor, if anything. Raft knew his place pretty quickly. He would never out-talk Cagney. But then, he didn't have to. Put George Raft lurking in a doorway and you had a scene. He just looked the part more than anyone else. He magnified the look of a 1930s gangster perfectly. Young toughs copied the white tie against the dark shirt and the hat brim slashed low. Raft's career momentum carried him next into Mae West's debut Hollywood vehicle, Night After Night. West cast him as a suave gangster boyfriend of her Texas Guinan-inspired nightclub character, and it was his first leading man role. Suddenly, Raft was top-billed opposite the era's reigning bombshell, oozing a self-possessed cool that audiences loved. Her desire to cast him soon revealed itself to contain another kind of desire, and the two began what was technically an affair, although by this time he'd been separated from Grace for years. Still, the studios were nervous about it. Once that fizzled out, with he and West remaining lifelong friends, he began intertwining his professional and personal life in a prodigious manner, and he had several notable affairs during the 1930s, not least of which was with Tallulah Bankhead, who was infamously voracious and wickedly smart. However, this was doomed to fail as Raft gave Bankhead a dose of gonorrhea, as she later detailed in her autobiography. He had also embarked on an affair with Hilda Ferguson, a thrillingly dangerous and tragic showgirl who died in 1933 after she and Raft had separated. There will be an episode about her in the future over on our new channel, Society Mysteries, so be sure to subscribe if that's something you'd like to see. Within a few years, he established himself as one of Paramount's go-to tough guys. In 1933, he starred in Midnight Club and then teamed with Wallace Beery in The Bowery as real-life diving hero Steve Brody. He even kept dancing in some pictures. In 1934's Bolero, he portrayed a Latin dance instructor paired with Carole Lombard. The pair managed to evoke an on-screen tango so sensuous that cinema-goers left the theaters speaking Spanish to their sweethearts. It was not all pure acting talent, however. Off-screen, they had a passionate affair that was widely reported in the gossip rags. Lombard, who swore like a prizefighter, later said that George was the greatest lover she ever had, and she would not be the last to make that particular claim. By the mid-1930s, Raft's celebrity was truly on the rise. His characteristically low-key style set him apart from his more manic colleagues. Co-star Spencer Tracy later said he had never met a tougher man off-screen. As Edward G. Robinson observed, Raft's face was a fantastic, arresting mask. He became such a fixture in gangster pictures that his colleagues built a legend of his abilities. Columnist Hedda Hopper noted in 1937 that Raft had, quote, made millions, but hasn't got 'em due to a fondness for gambling and a loyalty to helping old friends. Old friends being a gentle euphemism for the mob enforcers who kept him in the spotlight. He did indeed tip his winnings to buddies like Bugsy Siegel and saw money vanish on dice tables. He and Bugsy had been friends since they were kids, and while the true nature of Raft's involvement with organized crime will never be known, he had at one time been, at the very least, a wheelman for Siegel. In 1938, he was interviewed by the FBI not for his connection to Siegel, but to two other Jewish gangsters, Louis Buchalter and Jacob Shapiro, two of the leading figures in Murder Incorporated. This led to suspicions that the Jewish mob were responsible for Raft's career. In fact, it was Oni Madden who had quietly financed Raft's early Hollywood gamble, thinking it would be great to have one of their own on the big screen. Madden was an Irish-American gangster nicknamed the Killer, and was one of the major players in Prohibition-era bootlegging. He also ran the highly controversial Cotton Club, an illegal joint where a galaxy of legendary black performers entertained a strictly white-only audience during the 1920s and the Jim Crow era. So Raft arrived in movies with real street cred, and Hollywood played it up. Raft would later joke privately that whereas Cagney played tough, he was tough. Off-camera, Raft's personal life was still as headline-grabbing as any tabloid. In fact, his next affair was one of the most surprising of his life. He fell deeply in love with the grand dame of movies, Norma Shearer. Norma first met George at a party hosted by Charles and Pat Boyer, and the attraction between them was immediate. To most observers, the pairing seemed unlikely. Norma was at the height of her career after The Women, and the epitome of MGM refinement, while Raft was Hollywood's resident lurking underworld figure. Yet the chemistry between them was genuine. They became a visible couple, appearing together at social events across the country and abroad. She and Raft had more in common than people thought. The tough lady who took on the MGM bigwigs after Thalberg died ought to understand where a toughie like Raft was coming from, even if their ballparks weren't the same. Their relationship lasted through much of 1939 and 1940, during which they saw each other almost daily. But Raft remained legally bound to his estranged wife, Grace, and was still unable to obtain a divorce even after she sued him for a $500,000 settlement. Recognizing the situation's futility and worried about her children's welfare, Norma ended the affair, calling the decision, quote, sad but necessary. Despite the breakup, both continued to speak kindly of one another in later years. Norma echoed Carol Lombard's sentiments about George's special prowess in bed. Next, he had a well-publicized affair with Betty Grable, although it seems that by this time any prior gallantry dried up, as he was abusive to Betty, something I get into more detail in my episode on her, which you can check out after this one. I'll put a link in the description. Still, it seems Betty was also under his spell, their near 2-decade age gap notwithstanding. I would have married George Raft a week after I met him. I was so desperately, so deeply in love with him. But when you wait 2.5 years, there doesn't seem to be any future in a romance with a married man, she said. It was a familiar story by now, and Raft was doomed to spend his life bound to a woman he hadn't seen in almost 20 years, other than to continue their ongoing legal back and forth. By this time, Raft had reached the zenith of his movie career. Now under contract at Paramount Pictures, he was earning an astonishing $200,000 a year, making him the third highest paid actor in America, behind only Warner Baxter and Gary Cooper. Paramount built pictures around his screen presence. He headlined the drama Souls at Sea with Cooper and Sylvia Sidney, and in 1939 he co-starred with rising stars William Holden and a then relatively unknown Humphrey Bogart in Invisible Stripes, a prison-set crime drama. That same year, he shared the screen with James Cagney in Each Dawn I Die, and he again teamed with Bogart in 1940's They Drive by Night, a taut tale of truck drivers navigating danger, a film also noted for Ida Lupino's intense courtroom turn. However, on set, Raft often clashed with his co-stars, and no film portrayed the volatile mix of George Raft better than 1941's Manpower. The film was notorious for its bad-tempered set, and the main antagonism was between Raft and Edward G. Robinson. Shot in April 1941, the trouble began when Raft began berating Robinson over a line of dialogue that Raft objected to, and Robinson thought was worth including. This provoked a volley of insults from George. A week later, trouble between the pair flared again, but this time it happened while Life magazine's staff photographer was on set, and he caught an image that stunned movie lovers when it was published. The shot, as you can see, captures the moment Raft and Robinson began to exchange blows as cast and crew look on. Director Raoul Walsh had little success in taming the simmering feud between the stars. Raft, it seems, was the provocateur. He was jealous of Robinson's star billing. Given that Raft had far more screen time, he felt he ought to have topped the marquee. Instead, he was listed only third, behind Robinson and Marlene Dietrich. Dietrich was also a source of frustration for Raft, who had become infatuated with her and he believed she was sleeping with Robinson. Dietrich, who, like George, understood the power of a tailored suit and the erotic charge of a withheld smile, had Raft wrapped around her little finger. He even declined to slap Dietrich in a scene, saying, "I respect women," until both Walsh and Dietrich convinced him it was necessary. The irony is that Robinson was only cast after Raft refused to work with the other actor being considered for the role, Humphrey Bogart, who he openly disliked due to Bogart's politics. Robinson later said Raft was, quote, touchy, difficult, and thoroughly impossible to play with, although they would bury the hack shit in later years and star in movies together again as older men. Others admired him. Gangster Mickey Cohen later said he would want Raft to play him in a movie, quote, because the others would portray me as a vicious gangster, but George would not. Always, Raft seemed to know how to call in favors and call out threats, sometimes serious ones. When James Cagney became president of the Screen Actors Guild and battled the mafia's influence in Hollywood during the war, Cagney later insisted that he owed his life to Raft. Rumor had it a mob hitman was about to kill Cagney with a falling light, and Raft intervened, one way or another, to have the hit quietly called off. As a matinee idol of the underworld, Raft projected a polished menace. Studio photographers captured him smoking cigarettes while draped over a bar or leaning in a gangster's signature white silk tie. Because he never took silver screen acting seriously, he often brushed off script lines and claimed to memorize just enough to get through a scene. Raft relied on an almost criminally spare style. He joked that he never watched his own movies. "I always played the guy with the gun. I did 105 pictures, and I was killed 85 times. How unlucky can you go?" he would say, laughing that every big award on screen seemed to go to his co-stars while he'd always be the one to bite it. Away from cameras, Raft leaned into the war effort. He turned up on camp stages and bong drives tied to the Hollywood Victory Committee/Caravan Push, the same blitz of appearances later mythologized in the 1944 review film Follow the Boys, where his on-screen alter ego helps organize performers for servicemen. In late 1942, he even bought out his Warner Brothers contract to chase a planned stage piece about his Hell's Kitchen years, but it fizzled out, while New York authorities opened a tax inquiry and separately hauled him before a grand jury on underworld finance questions. He later gave evidence of a 1944 bookmaking trial tied to Bugsy Siegel, and by 1946 turned up in an Australian civil suit over an alleged assault. After Siegel's 1947 murder, Raft's name surfaced once again in the papers, gossip columns noting that the millions he'd made had somewhat mysteriously disappeared, and not all of it on the craps tables, as plenty seemed to head to Bugsy and friends as a form of gratitude. In 1941, Raft's movie career took a famously self-inflicted U-turn. Jack Warner's studio had acquired the rights to High Sierra, a gritty novel about a desperate gangster on the run. The young screenwriter was John Huston, and he wanted Raft to play Roy Earl, a gangster. Director Raoul Walsh thought Raft was perfect for the role, but Raft did the unthinkable. He snarled that he would not play a crook who goes to the chair. As Walsh explained that he had to die in the script, Raft reportedly barked back, "I'm not going to die." He even delivered a final message to studio chief Jack Warner, "Tell Jack Warner to shove it." In one swallow, he tossed away the lead in what would become a Warner classic. When everyone else passed on the part, Edward G. Robinson, James Cagney, and even Paul Muni bowed out. His old rival Bogart accepted. High Sierra became Bogart's breakthrough role, turning him from a second banana into a major star. Barely had the ink dried on that decision when the studio lined Raft up for another career gamble, The Maltese Falcon. John Huston was set to direct, and Raft's contract said he should be cast as Sam Spade, the lead. But once again, George fumbled a golden opportunity. Raft was simply handed the role on paper without so much as a meeting, and Huston began planning the shoot. George seethed but held his temper for now. It wasn't until 4 days before filming that Raft finally wrote an explosive letter to Jack Warner. The Maltese, he insisted, is not an important picture, and he had, quote, no obligation to make any film that wasn't important. It was a fateful move. Warner shrugged and once more replaced Raft with Bogart for Falcon. That film became another smash. Huston kept Spade's scenes tight, and he fully captured the dark wit of Dashiell Hammett's novel. Bogart's performance was another boost to his skyrocketing career. Raft never even showed for wardrobe. Silently, professionally, his absence echoed down the sound stages. Between these two decisions, tossing aside High Sierra and firing off his Maltese Falcon protest, Raft effectively squashed his standing at Warner's and ironically paved a path to stardom for a man he despised. A bitter Raft never got over living in the shadow of Bogart for the rest of his career, especially as everything Bogey had could have been his with a cooler head and a couple of yeses, instead of nos. Despite these blows, Raft still worked steadily throughout the 1940s. He kept one foot in gangster roles and another in some lighter fare. In 1942, he finally found a way to finish his Broadway story. He persuaded Warner Brothers to let him star in Universal's Broadway, a film which was largely based on his own early dancer days. The studio was so fed up with Raft's stubbornness, however, that they suspended him for 8 months before granting the loan out. And furthermore, Raft had to pay Warner $27,500 of his own money, so Warner's could borrow Robert Cummings from Universal in return. When it did come out, he played a character based on himself, a fictionalized version of a hoofer in 1920s New York. It was a self-referential bout of nostalgia, and a respite from the usual tough guy fare he was known for, but it was not a hit. Remarkably, Warner's rolled out another big project for Raft in 1942, and once again he walked away, leaving, once again, Bogart to pick up not only the pieces, but all the plaudits for the wartime spy comedy all through the night. By now, Raft's big career days were falling behind him. He did Background to Danger, essentially a war thriller with Nazi plots in Turkey. It was another tense set, and Raft insisted on major changes to his character, although he was vindicated when the film was a hit. However, just after shooting ended, Raft bought out the remainder of his contract at Warner Brothers and left the studio. In fact, Hollywood chatter had it that he could have played Rick Blaine in Casablanca. But in reality, Jack Warner and Hal Wollis had already settled on Bogart for that part. Another Hollywood myth was that Raft turned it down, but the studio at that point had decided Raft had become more trouble than he was worth. In truth, he could well have been offered the part had his track record with the studio been less volatile. Meanwhile, he was under the microscope once again with the authorities, this time being investigated for tax evasion after being found in arrears of several $100,000. Shortly afterward, Raft was offered the lead in Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity, only to awkwardly pass yet again. He apparently told Wilder that if the film were reworked as a comedy, he'd reconsider, an idea Wilder flatly rejected. Fred McMurray took the part of Walter Neff and gave cinema one of its most famous noir performances. Instead, he managed a couple of surprise hits, including 1945's Johnny Angel, and alongside a young Ava Gardner in Whistle Stop. Meanwhile, his mob associations brought him plenty of trouble, not least being dragged through a shower of negative publicity when his childhood friend and benefactor was murdered in what was most likely a mob hit in June 1947. Raft had taken the stand to defend Siegel's character in a trial just a couple of years earlier, so this only made his mob connections even murkier. The 1950s found Raft drifting through the film industry on old star power. He settled into gangster and tough guy roles in B-movies and support parts. On screen, he still brought that deadpan stare, but the pictures were smaller. In between, he took odd jobs related to his old network. He was offered a stake in Siegel's Flamingo Hotel following the boss's murder, and the plan was that Raft would become the entertainment director of the infamous Vegas gambling den. However, he was denied a gaming license due to his connections to organized crime, although 3 years later he did manage to obtain one on appeal. Meanwhile, he went into business in Havana with mob boss Santo Traficante Jr., where they opened the Capri Casino. Raft could be found minding craps tables at the Capri for the rest of the decade, at least almost the rest of it. In January 1959, Fidel Castro's troops arrived in Havana after a 3-year-long guerrilla war against the Cuban government, and Raft was in the Capri the night the revolutionaries arrived. Castro immediately closed all of Cuba's casinos, and Raft fled back to the U.S. by boat as chaos erupted. He took on a couple of notable supporting roles during this time, not least of which was opposite Robert Taylor in Rogue Cop. He also starred alongside Ginger Rogers in the classic noir Black Widow in 1954. In 1959, Raft made one of his most visible late-career film appearances in Billy Wilder's comedy, Some Like It Hot, playing Chicago mob boss Spats Colombo opposite Marilyn Monroe, Jack Lemmon, and Tony Curtis. In one scene, he glares at a hood flipping a coin and growls, "Where did you pick up that cheap trick?" A wink at the trademark gesture that had made him famous in Scarface. It was a knowing, good-humored parody of his own legend, and one of his last major appearances in a Hollywood classic. It could have been a comeback, but aside from an appearance in Ocean's 11 in 1960, it was more or less the end of George Raft's Hollywood career. However, a net was beginning to close in on Raft. In 1965, he was finally convicted on tax evasion charges, although he got away with a fine of only $2,500. The next year, he was dragged before a New York grand jury to testify about his organized crime connections. The heat was building, and Raft's powerful friends were mostly in their graves, watery or otherwise. It was time to get out before things took a serious turn. So the last chapter was set to be in London. In the swinging mid-60s, Raft became the face of mobsters Angelo Bruno and Mayor Lansky's newest venture, the Colony Sports Club. This was an upscale gambling hall on Piccadilly that the Cosa Nostra were hoping would turn into a mob foothold in London. Raft would, once more, operate as the frontman. He turned back into a real casino boss, dressed to the nines and hosting high society even as British tabloids sniffed scandal. However, the mob had long struggled to gain real influence in London, and the British government had very low tolerance for American organized crime operations. And so after returning to the U.S. for a vacation in 1967, Raft was denied re-entry to Britain altogether, officially banned as an undesirable mob frontman. The news embarrassed both the Colony Club and Raft, but the British weren't negotiating. Raft was out, and that was the end of it. George Raft spent his last years quietly back in Los Angeles, a shadow of the figure who once prowled studio lots and speakeasy wings. He picked up TV roles, B-movies, and even briefly became the face of Alka-Seltzer. Work barely trickled in, his mob connections had long dried up, and money ran out. By the end of the 1970s, he was broke, living off $800 a month he collected from his Social Security check and a pension. His health was also failing, and he battled emphysema. In November 1980, at age 79, he passed away, alone, with little money and even less fanfare, an almost forgotten figure. He left behind a thimble-sized estate. Reports say his home held a $10,000 life insurance policy, and a battered wardrobe containing some finely tailored but ancient gangster suits, which a dealer later sold for a few $100s as Raft left no will. There was no grand funeral or spotlight biography awaiting him, only the unceremonious closure of a checkered life. His story is a kind of morality play, tragic in its wasted chances, thrilling in its almost unbelievable highs, and murky in the unseen criminal hands who pulled his strings. For those who remember, George Raft remains one of Hollywood's original tough guys, complicated, charismatic, and altogether unforgettable in the mystery of his life and movies. Well, that's about all for this episode. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video with a friend if you enjoyed it. Why not leave me a comment to tell me which of George's roles you remember best? I've been Ava, this has been Hollywood Mysteries, and until next time, sweet dreams.